Interviews, most commonly employed, they can be unstructured or structured, deceptively simple, can have an open conversation. I recall one research colleague that used to say to me, I've only got one question I ever ask, tell me about your business. And he used to say that was it, and then everything that followed on from tell me about your business were kind of derivatives or laddered conversations from tell me about your business. And he always claimed that once people began to talk about themselves and about the business, he couldn't stop them, so he'd just let them talk and he'd make sense of it later. There might be a little bit of shaping in that conversation that happens, but that would be a fairly unstructured or less structured approach. But sometimes you will have protocol sheets for your interviews which would be semi-structured, I suppose, and you would have a guide and you would try to guide people to topics of interest that you wanted to understand better. And you might use the interview to try and understand theoretical reasons or to gain theoretical insights into what's going on. You know, you might have some ideas of some theory in the background, maybe for your lens to look at this issue or this problem. And sometimes you might try and guide conversations to discuss things that are going to throw light on perhaps a theoretical insight or a theoretical understanding of the issue. And you can use these things across the different approaches. Interviews are common across all the approaches that we've talked about. We would use interviews perhaps as an approach in case studies, in grounded theory, in phenomenology. We would use them in those sorts of studies. Here's some summaries of the way in which interviews have been used in grounded theory and phenomenology and ethnography. In grounded theory, early aim to understand the breadth and depth of a topic. We'd do in-depth discussion, we'd keep it loosely structured, we'd let the people, the participants' voice come through strongly. And as the study progresses, we start to link those conversations to concepts and theories that we are developing as part of our understanding of the issue. So we do that as the researcher. And people tend to get more focused, and perhaps sometimes we get more focused. Had a PhD candidate in the last few years who was looking at how employment decisions were made in new startup businesses. And she did her work looking at these organisations. Well, there weren't organisations, they were sometimes just one person or a few people. But they had aspirations to grow and get bigger. So she started having conversations with them and mapping out their ideas in discussion on pieces of paper and then representing that information back to them and having a conversation around what they meant by the various things that they identified on the map, as it were. So that was a very useful way. It wasn't grounded theory, but it was a study using effectuation. So that was that. Phenomenology, understand the lived experience, bracket any pre-understandings. Phenomenologists, and particularly Husserl, I think, used to say that when we observe the world and when we meet people and engage in conversation, that we are looking at a world that's pre-theoretical. There's no theory. We're having a discussion. But perhaps through the discussion and observation, we then start to put theory around the way people will act or behave or do things. But we would have non-directive, broad open questions, probe and reflect. We'd go back to the interviewee and we'd just keep following up. And Van Maan and others looked at, they talk about the very nature of the thing in itself. We're concerned with the thing in itself. Ethnographers are always interested in cultural meanings, and so for an ethnographer, the conversations have a purpose. There's always a purpose. Even the silences in conversation have a purpose. Interviews can take a responsive approach, where we're flexible and we adapt as we move through the interview. Or they could be structured. Sometimes interviews are structured in large-scale studies because they want people to address the same issues in different organisations or different cases that they look at. But I would think in most cases flexible and responsive, adaptive interviews are the way to go with qualitative research. You can do face-to-face, you can do telephone interviews, you can interview people over the internet. But whatever you do, the interview itself has to have some critical consideration. So don't waste any interview questions. Always have good questions. Think about them carefully. Don't just ask a question because you can. Make sure it's got something to offer to the research. You can take a structured or semi-structured approach we talked about. You can have one-to-one interviews, which a lot of qualitative interviews would tend to be, or you could employ group interviews, and people, for example, might want to conduct a focus group. Focus groups are particularly efficient ways to gather a lot of information quickly about a topic that's not very well understood, and if you get the right group of people in the room, you can learn a lot in a very short time. You know, perhaps in an hour you can be very efficient in your management of the research to get some good insights that will lead you elsewhere on your journey to finding out stuff. The location is always interesting with an interview. Where do you have the interview? Come to my office at 5 o'clock. Maybe not, no. Because that may put some kind of bias into the interview process. Go to the site and meet a person on the site that where the activities or the practices that you're trying to understand are carried out, and perhaps walk around the site with the person. An interview while you're walking around is possible, and might be an effective means, or on neutral territory might be an effective means where both parties feel reasonably relaxed and you can have a conversation about an important topic. But you have to think about where the location should be for your interview. You know, you need to think about that carefully. Sometimes it's cut and dried because you only get the opportunity to do that interview at a particular time in a particular place. But sometimes you've got choice over this, and you ought to think carefully about the choice that you have. Are you going to just do one interview, or are you going to do a series of interviews? You might just do one with some people. You might only have time for one. On the other hand, your strategy might have been carefully planned so that you had interviews with the same person several times over a couple of years or 3 years. It might have been a longitudinal piece of qualitative work. The researcher I told you about looking at employment decisions in the small firms started off looking at an incubation centre and looking at people in those incubation centres and interviewed them several times over a period of 2 or 3 years. That's what they actually did. And so there was a track record of history. Some of them failed, by the way, on the way. Some of them grew bigger. Some of them dropped out. Some of them merged. There were all sorts of things that happened. And it was quite interesting. But it was built into the strategy of the research right from the start. They can be short or they can be lengthy. What role are you going to adopt in the interview? Are you learning yourself? Are you reflexive in the process of doing the interview? Some people come back from their very first interview and tell me, it was very different to the way I thought it was going to be. They say it was a lot different, you know. And actually, when I'd done the first one, I felt more confident for the second one. And after I'd done 3 of these interviews, I was even better then than I could have ever imagined. I'd become not very skilled, but I'd become a lot more skilled at kind of homing in on the things that were important and very good at leaving out the things that were not so important. And you get to understand people, don't you, interviewing. So you can learn a lot from the process. Are you an active listener? Can you strike up a rapport? Some people don't listen. You know, you see it, don't you? Sometimes people will just launch in with a whole series of questions and then they don't give the person an opportunity to answer those questions properly because they can't keep quiet or they can't sit silent for a second. And sometimes those silences in interviews become very important. Actually just sitting there for a second or two and just kind of listening and encouraging without saying anything can actually be quite revealing. So the learning the interview skills and the approach is that you can take to get people to engage is quite a skill.